First of all, were there any kind of like key ideas or, initiatives, something that should be approached? Like at the table I was sitting at, some interesting things came up, and so maybe you can share kind of what that was. And maybe we'll start with you, Helena.
Yeah, our person who was recording our great thoughts and ideas went upstairs, so I'm going to rely on these two. My name is Helena. I'm with the Office of Language Access, so you can imagine how important this is to us. And our table focused on literacy, which is, from our perspective, being service providers from the state and trying to build capacity is we don't even know how to measure literacy of the very people that we're trying to serve and the capacity that we're trying to build. My office is tasked to support the recruitment and retention of language providers. And even though they're maybe proficient in their native languages, some of the languages are, the testing, or most of them, are not being tested here in Hawaii currently. And so not just the literacy of the service providers, but also the public that we're trying to serve. We're creating materials. For example, our big discussion was on translating materials and how, sure, we do it because it's a mandate even, and we can sleep better at night that we follow the law, but we don't know whether it's really effective. So our goal, I think, first is to assess the need and the problem and trying to get some good data. So I'm going to pass it on to Gerald because he can expound more on the need for data.
Historically, the last data set that I know of is a literacy in English. And that's 1974 for Hawaii, when the Governor's Committee on Literacy did a survey. And as far as I know, we don't have similar statistics for literacy in your own language if it's not English. So we're doing all these translations. We have no idea to what extent are they effective. Now we're using national stats to determine you're supposed to do it at the 3rd grade level or the 5th grade level, or whatever that is. But we don't even know whether that's effective as well.
Or what that means.
Yeah, what that means. Oh, that's true, what that means.
Great. So that was kind of one idea that came from a table around literacy was we need more data about the literacy levels of the various languages that are in these communities, both at kind of the adult level, but also children coming to school. What really, and maybe not just even their literacy level, but what is their real proficiency in what we would call a home language, because that can vary, extremely. So, okay.
Program planning as well as for legislation, because the legislators always ask us, what's your proof? Yeah. What's your data?
To justify the proof, the need for.
Great, and thank you. And I see it looks like it's already passed a couple of people. Go ahead.
Our table talked a little bit about what it would look like in the classroom for implementation to gauge the proficiency of the teachers in the native language, as well as then we went into assessment on what that assessment, the stamp assessment looks like and how it works and how it would be implemented here, off-site or on campus, our DOE hardware and software and bandwidth and all those other technical issues that come up whenever we do online testing. So those are some of the discussions we had.
Great, and I have more information I can provide around STAMP and other assessments in a little bit.
Okay, so the group I had was the secondary, post-secondary. So part of the key ideas is that one of the things that came out was that, okay, all of this is being generated by the University of Hawaii at Manoa. However, we do, coming from the DOE perspective, we also have other major universities, college campuses. Are they going to be brought into the discussion? Because our high school students will feed into Chaminade, BYU, HPU, but they are not a part of these discussions right now. So in order for this seal of biliteracy to really take effect, I think everybody needs to be on the same plane, right? So that was one of those ideas. And then the second was, okay, with this seal of biliteracy, what is the plan, or how is a university going to foresee getting that personnel into for our schools. So one of the questions that I asked, because there were the Japanese teachers there, what percentage of your Japanese language students actually feed into education, teaching as a field? So that, it was very small. So the question then becomes, how do we get it so that these language speakers will go into education?
Very true, very true.
I'm going to pass for now, I think.
I'm going to pass. I was part of the literacy group.
Ours was workforce development and job preparation. It's a huge topic for us. Most of the time when we're talking about workforce development, we're talking about just training in the skill set you need, not thinking about the language part. And this has opened up a whole nother level of understanding and not area we need to understand better and incorporate into what we're doing. We also talked about generally when a person's going through a career pathway and learning a particular field, then we put them in an internship or some kind of experience at the end, and just to tell us if we did a good job. Whether, and many times, I won't say many times, but often, students will get to the end and decide, this is not what I want, now that I've actually done it. So what's happening around the country and where we're talking about doing here is flipping that model. Somewhere around middle school, certainly before 9th grade, they should be able to try all the different pathways. Actually try it. Go out if you can into a site and get a real work experience, get a sense of what it's like so you can filter out the ones you definitely don't want and just focus on the ones you do want. And that way, you're much more likely to choose when you are choosing a pathway to really study. You're going to choose something much more likely to finish, much more likely you're going to be happy with, and you'll get through faster, which saves us all this money at the post-secondary level because they're in what they want and they're going to get through faster. So we're looking at flipping that model and doing a lot more career exploration before we decide. Where the language fits in this, we've still got to work it out.
Thank you. I was in the group on assessment, and we talked a lot about the kinds of questions that we had about the exams that are out there, and I know that you're going to deal with that, so I'm excited about hearing more. Also talking about data collection in terms of who are the teachers who currently work for the district, and are there people who could teach another language if they got a little bit more training or they got a little bit more, if they had the opportunity to do so. And so one recommendation that I was bringing from some of the school districts I work with was to do a survey of your existing and your current teachers to find out who says they speak a language other than English. And then from there, are you interested in furthering that? And then eventually testing them to make sure that, in fact, they could, they're at a level to actually teach it. So starting with your current workforce first, and then think about, too, some career ladder pathways so that if you have people who work in your schools as assistants or aides, that they may already speak the language, they live in the community, and then possibly helping them to go and get credentialed so that they can actually teach in the classroom. So anyway.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andy. I sat with a bunch of principals, middle and high school mostly, and it sort of reflects some of the things we're talking about here, in that one of the struggles in adding new languages, for example, is that you don't have the staff necessarily. You have to have a person who's willing to build a program, and if it's just one language and they don't have any other skill sets, that means for the first year, maybe you're working as a PTT for $23 an hour. Maybe you'll get your prep time paid for, maybe not, who knows? And so you have to just build this program, and then if you can last that long, it still may only be like a half-time position. So from the start, you can see that there are some possible obstacles if we're not looking long-term and trying to build teachers who have either other skill sets or where we're building programs to allow for high schools to even offer additional languages. And then maintaining them, and because once you lose them, they're really hard to bring back. And I ended up in my position because it's happened. It's happened to me. I also managed a career ladder grant at one point. So the models are out there. It's not easy, and it's going to take quite a bit to make this valuable vision a reality. And it's definitely worthwhile, but we really need to think hard and put our actions behind this.
Yeah, do you want to just build on that one?
Sort of to build on what Andy said, I think also we need to sort of rethink or revisit how we introduce languages to students, because coming from an educational environment, the students select languages sometimes for the wrong reasons. It's because their best friends are learning Spanish, or because there's an image that one language is easier than the other. So I think there has to be some other way, to a more effective way, to really talk to students about languages, what it means, and their uses, so that they can give a more thoughtful consideration of what they're going to take. And then another thing that's so difficult in the schools is that the foreign language teachers have to compete against one another for students. It's sort of their lifeblood, and if they don't get enough students, then their jobs get cut, or their time gets cut. And so that kind of situation in the school environment also is not very healthy, unfortunately.
Here, I'll take it back. There's so many topics we can cover, and it's been interesting to see the things around the teacher preparation aspects and teacher retention. I was not asked to speak to that topic, but it's actually one of the things I work most on in my current job, and have been for some years. I'm going to continue passing it around again, so some people who didn't have a chance to talk yet can have a chance. So we're still, if there's an idea that you guys had that you didn't feel you had surfaced yet, you're welcome to still bring that forward. If you already shared an idea and want to say anything about the kind of the timeline or resources needed, those were the other two questions, feel free to add to something that was already brought forward. I think we'll try to kind of stick to the general topics that were in the lunch breakout, because obviously we could go in 25 directions, but let's just go around again.
Hello.
Good to pass on.
I'm Lily. I'm from the Department of Labor. My training is in law. I'm a lawyer. I had lunch with No Okimoto and I think and one other person from the Department of Labor and one from the DOE. And our group was supposed to discuss information and outreach. And one of the ideas to promote the seal of biliteracy was to reach out to community language schools, after school or weekend language schools, to reach out to students and parents, or the students who go to those schools. Another suggestion, which was Noel's suggestion, was to promote biliteracy even at the university level between language departments and, for example, in the College of Business or the College of Ag, where there would be, a connection between learning a language and also studying some other field. So that were the two ideas that we had.
I was with Tarina and Bernadette on the workforce. To add on to what Bernadette had shared, I think we had brought up also the need to have skills building in each of the pathways. So Tarina had brought up about interpreters, but whether you are in the industrial engineering technology pathway or in agriculture, there would be a need for this as a skill set. So how do we integrate languages into those?
I was in the group with assessment with Elizabeth, and Lynette is there in the back there, and she's the person who could best share. But just to cover a few points other than what Elizabeth has shared, assessment portion, the challenge is we're talking about there was a timeline for that, and not knowing exactly what kind of assessments are out there. Reference was the assessments are out there, but I have not yet, or others in the department have not yet visited that. So as far as timeline, yeah, immediate, yes, we do need to have some kind of a timeline, but we're not sure what would be our ideal timeline for that. I do realize there is an indication that class of 2017 will have the opportunity to receive seal of biliteracy. And I'm quite nervous because I'm actually the educational specialist for world language and fine arts. And I just started about a month ago, and so this is a new thing for me as well. Also, talking about the assessment, there's so many different type of assessments. Of course, I understand there are many different languages. If you have one student with really not a very common language, they come and they want to be assessed and take this exam, we do need to offer that for that one student. So we need to be available for all those things too. So we're not prepping only for, 6 or 7 major languages that we share in the secondary schools, but we're looking at all languages. So there's quite a challenge there.
Okay, I was on the table for workforce and enjoyment of the language in education. So in order to employer to trust seal of biliteracy, I believe that seal of biliteracy has to have can-do statement. The student was certified with seal of biliteracy can do this, can do that. Otherwise, how employer can trust the seal of biliteracy on the resume, their resume. So I think we need to work on that, and not only AP3 passed or whatever the test passed, but what they can do. So we have to narrow down for that.
I was with the assessment group, so.
Same. Same. I'll pass. Be on the same group.
Just quickly to add to the literacy group is we definitely determined that to get good data is to actually have a person or people to kind of gather and compile and and identify where those data where the data are, and then also to if there is a need to even go back to an assessment, then we need to work together with those folks. We do have resources identified in a way. We have materials that can increase literacy of even students going for seal of biliteracy. We also look at after-school programs that can be expanded and where we funnel some volunteers there and read to kids and kind of just develop that area. But we talk about funding, which is really what everyone needs, I think, and in order to mobilize. So,
Yeah, I think our group is also a branch of literacy. I think one point that our group seemed to be thinking about is the lack of resources in terms of teachers that can actually deliver the language instruction.
So now I'll speak. So I was also in the assessment group, and kind of piggyback on what I heard here, a lot of what particularly my personal concern was equity. And I don't know that we have that part figured out. Anyway.
I'll pass for now. I was with the literacy group.
You mentioned about money, and that's a very big, important part because some of these exams cost money to students. And so I heard today 3 businessmen sitting up there saying, we need this. This is a place you have to tap. Is if the hotel industry, for example, is looking for and needs people who can speak a variety of languages, getting them to fund either scholarships or whatever. I know, Michele, you got a huge grant from Microsoft to...
It's actually Gates Foundation.
I'm sorry, yeah. Gates Foundation. Same sort of thing there.
Yeah. There's a difference.
But yes, but indeed looking for funds.
One of the other things that I think most of us probably embrace is that we need to start this process early on. So elementary school, have kids have this mindset of learning languages, and it really will change their culture and belief systems and open doors possibly. But to do that, and I've heard some of the people here also say that we need the funding. It's already on our report card, by the way. It says, typically on the elementary report card, says not applicable. But the space for the world language is on the report card. It's just rarely is it offered. And then if the funding isn't categorical, or if it's not strong enough, what you will hear principals say is, oh, well, we have to make this hard choice. And whether it's ESL or world languages, sometimes that choice doesn't fall the way that most people here would probably want it to.
Great. I think if you don't mind, I would like to share a couple of things with you, because I think it'll answer some of the questions I'm hearing here, and then that would allow us more time to come back and return to processing things that you've already been thinking about, plus any new questions that come up from the information I have. Does that sound okay? So I know there were questions just about implementing the seal of biliteracy, and that thing has got several aspects to it, one of the big ones being assessing language. And so I kind of separated that out into a separate PowerPoint, which I can go through. I'm thinking I'll go through these things fairly quickly, because you'll be able to see the PowerPoints later to go more in detail. There are a couple of our state websites that I would like to show you that I think will also be a help to you, but we won't go into a great deal of detail on those, or that could take up the whole time. Does that sound okay? So in a sense, the first part here, how Washington districts are implementing the state seal of biliteracy, is sort of the message is, it can be done. And it's not that complicated. It can actually be done in a short period of time if necessary. So here are the things that I'll highlight here. Highline School District is a smaller district than Seattle. It's just south of us. They have schools that are actually technically in the Seattle schools boundary, but their school board has set a goal of every student bilingual, biliterate by 2020. And so the seal of biliteracy is the measure. So in essence, their goal is by 2020, every student in their district should be able to earn the seal. Fortunately, something like maybe 60% of their students are ELLs or came in as ELLs, so they have a lot of language capacity that arrived in their district. However, there's still a heck of a lot of students that have to learn language starting from the beginning. So they also have expanded a lot of dual language immersion programs in Spanish and recently Vietnamese, and improving the quality of what's happening in their middle and high school world language programs. So they're kind of covering all bases. I'll also just briefly talk about what we did in Seattle around the seal this year. I've got some questions that came from Hawaii around these things that may be ones that you have as well. And then I kind of pulled out of that some sort of step-by-step things districts need to do. So Highline this past June awarded 193 Seal of Biliteracy recipients in 23 languages. They were identified by looking at the student database system to see who had earned competency-based credits. They had to also verify with AP and IB coordinators who had passed those exams, because AP and IB tests are not on the state transcript. I don't believe they're on the common transcript. So you really have to go to the people that are involved in administering the exams to get that information. And as I mentioned this morning, seniors that take AP and IB exams don't have that information before graduation. They get it in July. So then after the fact, you could go back and do it. They recognized all the students at graduation at a school board meeting and school assemblies, and they used a medallion, and they were kind enough to order enough that Seattle was able to buy some from them. And so these are the medallions that we sent out to every student that we identified as qualifying. So at the central level at each district, we came up with the list of students that we believed qualified. However, then we had to check them with the schools to make sure they really were going to graduate. Maybe they were deficient in some credits, so then they don't get the seal, even if their language skills are there. We sent that little medallion and then a little card that basically just said, congratulations, you got the seal, please wear this at graduation. Later, we also sent a picture of how the sticker seal could be affixed to the diploma. And that's a whole nother conversation about why decision was made to put a sticker on a diploma as opposed to a separate certificate, and I can talk about that later if that's helpful. So because so many of the students in Highline School District came out of their competency-based credit effort, it's really kind of went hand in hand. They have always had a very robust outreach program, so they go to each school to talk to students about earning credits, or in this case, the seal of biliteracy. They have a coordinator in each site for world language credits by proficiency or competency-based credits. They make flyers, a PowerPoint, a video of their district, and so on. And the students pre-register for testing at the school. So when they come to the school, the students have already indicated, I want to get tested in Somali, I want to get tested in Tigrinya, I want to get tested in Burmese, or whatever the language is, Samoan. The first meeting is kind of an overview. They do a writing sample and a self-assessment. We also have a self-assessment in Seattle that's just in the form so that we have an idea of how the students think how comfortable they are. And if they rate themselves as not very comfortable writing or reading, then we go back and ask them if they really want to take the test and so on. The second meeting, they have a permission form from the families, a sample test, and more details about the testing and about the seal. So they do a lot of outreach directly in each of their schools. That doesn't happen that way in Seattle, in part because we're such a big district, and we did some of those kinds of sessions early on, and we found that kind of word got out and people just knew what to do, and so we just make the test dates at this point. Then the third meeting is the actual test date when the students come and take the various tests. In about 6 to 8 weeks, they get results and a letter sent to the school, and that letter would indicate, in this case, how many credits they qualified for, and it would also potentially indicate that they qualify for the seal. Probably most of the communications about the seal will happen a little later in the year. For one thing, we don't want to promise the seal until we know they're going to graduate. And so I think there's probably no way of avoiding the running around in that kind of June timeframe, because you don't want someone to think they get something that they're not ready for at that point. You can see the blue items are things that the central office in that district supports, and then the red are things that happened at the school level. So the goal has been, I think, in both Highline and our district in Seattle and other major districts that are doing it. We have a number of large districts in the state. Evergreen School District, which is in Vancouver, Washington, near Portland, has been testing hundreds of students. I mean, I'm not kidding you, hundreds. And there's just somebody that sort of ends up in that role. Sometimes it's an assessment person, it could be an ELL person, it could be an administrative staff that becomes the champion, or a world language teacher. And that person becomes personally invested in these students getting the seal or the credits and so on, and then it makes it happen. You don't have to have language expertise to be a coordinator in that kind of role. You just have to care about kids. Here's some of how they get the word out. So they do talk about the proficiency scale. You can see that inverted pyramid is what ACTFL uses to help people understand that when you're at the novice level, you don't have much breadth. There's not a lot you can do. It's familiar topics. And to get to higher levels, you have a larger breadth. It also makes it clear that while the seal of biliteracy is a major achievement, it's not like you're ready to be an interpreter. You need to be at superior level to be an interpreter or translator officially. But we also know that kids that really barely have language skills are all the time being asked to interpret for their parents in very high stakes situations like special ed meetings, for example. So, we want to get the path, the movement toward higher levels of proficiency, but you don't want to discourage people too much either. But you just want to be honest about the information. And so you can see how they provide all of this explanation and talk to the families and so on. They've been very thorough about that in there. Some of their challenges is that, like the one I mentioned, the AP and IB students, you'd like them to be marching in their senior, with the seal. And they don't have the data from the AP or IB exams. Now, of course, as I mentioned, all of the languages that we do AP and IB are major languages like French, Spanish, Latin, potentially Japanese, Chinese. So any of the students that would be potentially qualifying for the seal via AP and IB could as easily take the stamp test for $20 and have that information, qualify for the seal, and march with their fellow students. So if it matters to them, they could take an extra test. And it's also a useful thing because stamp is and ACTFL tests, they're not quite, they're definitely not the same as AP and IB. It's just that AP and IB are reasonable test to use, and because students are already incurring time and expense to take them, it's reasonable to have them qualify as tests for the SEAL. Yes?
May I ask, is the STEM test got any employment?
I'm going to tell you everything about the stamp in just a few minutes. They also have messaging just about with career and college specialists, and you're trying to get that information, posters encouraging them, and so on. So those are all things that they're trying to they're challenging themselves in Highline to be even more effective about the value of the SEAL. The Highline is those 7 districts I mentioned this morning are also part of this group, and one of our new campaigns after the SEAL is now kind of launched is the Speak Your Language campaign. So it's a whole home language campaign starting from early birth, really, to give the message to families and schools about the value of maintaining and developing a home language. We see it as needing to go into the communities so they get a different messaging than they may have gotten from teachers or doctors or whoever. But we also have to do it with the education community, because they're one of the biggest sources of the misinformation. Like, you must go home and speak English to your child because they have to learn English, so don't speak Tagalog with them. And instead of speak Tagalog and read Tagalog and have them to fully develop Tagalog, because the more that they're comfortable in the language that was of their home, the better they'll do in English. You know, that's what the research shows, but families don't know that, and educators are the worst ones that don't know that. I've got like one slide on Seattle just kind of summarizing. I mentioned the stats for you a little bit earlier. This one lists some of the languages for this last year. I mean, I'm telling you, we did this in 2 weeks, pulling this information together in Seattle. A lot of the students we've tested have tested at 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th. So they just weren't in the senior group, but there'll be a bigger group this year just because there's a lot more seniors and kids that we've collected from 9th, 10th, and 11th. So one thing is that at the district level, you'll have to keep track of who earned competency-based credits when. So if they earned 4 competency-based credits in 9th grade, now 3 years later, you've got to remember that they did, so they qualified for the SEAL. So we're starting to keep kind of a running file of all students who qualified language-wise, so that we'll be ready to grab them when they become seniors. And again, as I mentioned, we did something similar to what Highline did. Let's see, I have a couple of examples someplace here, if I didn't lose them. Okay, yeah, so we sent, I showed you already this kind of thing, that we showed them where to put the seal on their diploma. We gave them the medallions. We talked about having the seal like on a certificate. We had done certificates in the past just for the credits. And our Department of Information said, no. If you put a seal like on a certificate, that becomes an official district document, and you have to maintain copies of that in perpetuity. So they said it was fine to keep the data, that the fact it'll be on their transcript. That's already was a change at the state level. But at the moment, the transcript just says check off. You got the seal, didn't get the seal. And in the future, there will actually be a place for storing the data about what language and how they demonstrated the proficiency for that. It's not there in place yet. So the compromise was they get a sticker to put onto their diploma, and then the medallion was actually something that the Highline folks tried out the year before, and it was so popular with the students. They liked it better than a cord, because you have different colored cords and you don't know what they all mean, but this one is really clear. So they were very happy and excited about having that. In addition, we sent letters home related to just the SEAL, not any earlier competency-based credits, which they would have already heard about, but this one would say exactly what the fact that they earned the SEAL and how they demonstrated their proficiency. So it looks like I didn't print any that were for AP, but in principle, it would be a letter that looks like this, and it says what language, when you were tested, and what your score was. So if you got a 5 on an AP exam, it would say 5, even though you didn't need a 5 in order to get the SEAL. And so for the proficiency-based credits, this is actually the style of letter that we use for reporting the test results. So for example, this one is a stamp test for Spanish. So there's reading, writing, listening, speaking. They each have a score. We use the stamp level, which corresponds to the actual proficiency level. So A 1 is a novice low, which wouldn't show up because that doesn't earn you any credit. So novice mid would be 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. But it'll show if you had, maybe you were intermediate low in reading, but you were advanced low in speaking. That'll show that. That's very, very impressive. And that's why we encourage the students to use the letters as something to share with employers. It's not just the fact you got a seal, but that says a lot more about you than just the fact that you got a seal or that you got 4 credits, for example. So we have different models of letters here. I just brought some examples of that. The other thing I should mention in relation to the competency-based credits is that we have a brochure which is translated into about the 10 top languages in Washington State, which aren't always the top languages in any given district. So sometimes people say, well, my language is not listed. Yes, but it says there that any language can be tested. So anyway, this brochure is just about what the steps are for students. And it helps them see, like, determine if you're eligible. Can you speak the language? Can you read and write too? So they kind of see pretty early on that you actually have to be able to read and write if you're going to do this. Okay, now we get into some of the questions that were passed on to me from Hawaii around the implementation of the seal. So here were some mechanics of implementation. So I didn't write in the answers. I'll just kind of go over them. Well, first of all, glance through those questions and see, do those look like questions you want me to answer? Anybody interested in those questions? There's others, so we can go on if you don't. If those aren't of interest to you, these might not be for this audience. Maybe some other audience would like to know, at least my take on these. Are any of those particularly 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2, 3, 4 interesting? 1, bullet 1? Okay. So is the school's internal check the final check? Is there any oversight from the State Department of Ed or reporting to State Department of Ed? Well, that's a very interesting question. In terms of the seal of biliteracy, all accountability currently rests with the district to keep track of the students, to identify who they are, keep track of it, and then get it reported on their transcripts. When I was at the State Department of Education, the Superintendent of Public Instruction, the way we envisioned it and the way that it was kind of set up through the legislation is that money was allocated to the state office so that we could coordinate. Then it would have been the idea that a district would determine who said that they were going to need it. They'd send us the list, and if it was information we had, like, for example, competency-based credits that had been coordinated by the state office, then we would double check that. But main thing is that we'd have the list. We'd know exactly which students were considered to have qualified, and we would be able to report on that information. And then the idea is that we would send them the stickers, at least for the diplomas. The medallions were kind of an innovation. They cost a couple dollars if you buy them in bulk. It's not like a big expense. Honestly, when I did the fiscal note for the bill, I mean, we included like $250 to send something to the district for each student that would qualify. So it's not unreasonable, I think, for the state to support it, but it didn't really happen that way. So really the oversight at the moment is at the district level. However, if you remember in the morning, the legislation requires a report in 2017. So in the next few months, I think the state's going to be scrambling to figure out how will they have that data to do that report. Any other questions on this page that look particularly interesting? I guess one question is the list of awardees publicly available? We did not publish a list that way. We did give a summary report to the school board when we had the school board honoring session, and there was a version of it that was sort of a summary, and then there was a version that was by high school, which languages and how many students that they could have. Okay, so the resources needed. Well, let's say that you figured out how testing is going to happen, whether it's AP, IB, competency-based, or whatever. So if testing is being dealt with over here, then the mechanics are really how do you make it actually happen, and I have some steps around that in just a moment. So there were questions about the role of the Department of Education. And as I just explained, our state office of Superintendent of Public Instruction is going to need to redefine what they're going to do. It's because, I left the office in August of 2014. Someone else worked October 2014 till July of 2015. Someone else was hired in November, then went on leave for knee surgery and is just in the job like a couple weeks. So we're kind of like you guys, we got new people sorting out exactly what needs to happen. It should be that it it could be, and maybe if they're going to do reporting, they'll have to be a central repository of what's happening in the state. And that is precisely because of the equity issue. If it turned out that almost everybody getting seals was AP or IB, and it was like, you know, a few dozen schools in the state that offer AP and IB courses, the legislature is not going to be happy because their intention is to have it as equitable as possible. So at the moment, in relation to competency-based credit testing, when I launched the program in 2011, all the testing pretty much, there was a couple districts that did it on their own, but otherwise we were sort of the central place that knew about it, and I can explain that process separately. But this last year, OSPI made a decision not to be actively involved in supporting the testing. So they provide technical information on the website, but not active support. We are hoping that the educational service districts, which are regional offices, might take more of a support role, especially in the rural parts of the state where they really don't have the capacity in every single small district to do that. Regarding tracking the awardees, I just said that OSPI, the state doesn't actually have information tracked around AP and IB, that you have to get that from the testing coordinators and people like that. I think, is that true for you guys too? Yeah.
I have that.
And you are?
I'm Gianna, the AP program manager for the state.
Okay, great. So somebody that actually has a relationship with the College Board and AP has access to that data, but it doesn't just show up at like principals' offices and places like that necessarily. As I mentioned, the competency-based credit testing is now managed basically by the districts. We do support, through our World Language Association, WAFL, that I mentioned this morning, we continue to offer what we call small-scale testing support. So if a district is really small and they only have 5 to 10, 15 students that need to be tested, then we'll support them in that. It was just last year we ended up supporting districts that had 300, and it was crazy. And I mentioned the report already. I do consider that issue around accountability to be a critical one. I don't see how a state office could not want to have a central role in that. It may be that belongs as much to the ELL, or bilingual ed is what we call it, migrant bilingual department at our state office, as world languages. But it should have some ownership somewhere, and there's a heck of a lot of money that goes to support bilingual ed, or ELL, however you call it in your particular state, and so there should be ways to get support for that. The information that OSPI posts has the details of the state rules, the things I mentioned this morning. It has this graphic that explains the criteria. As one I had on the PowerPoint. I made a few copies if anybody wants one. It provides guidance for data collection, so our system is called CEDARS, and information about ordering the seal. So the idea is that if a district came to the state site, they could figure out what to do. And we try to then support more from the level of grassroots, world language teachers and district-to-district support, communications that way. We're a very grassroots state. Okay, so here's what I would call kind of the how-to. So what districts need to do? First, they need to have a way to identify the candidates. So somebody needs to be kind of a point person. That's me. And I also partner with a couple of other people in our ELL and International Programs department who help with this. I had to identify who in our district would know how to figure out who got IB and AP test results. And then I had to collect the names of the students. I knew who got competency-based credits because we're also the people that coordinate that. And then we needed to figure out who do we talk to in each high school. Could start with the counseling office, but maybe it's an administrative assistant that's actually the person who organizes the graduation ceremony or something. So you have to kind of figure that out. And those are the people that need to get, like the envelopes to give the students so they have the medallion to wear at graduation and so on. And then who can actually verify, which is going to be counselors, and sometimes it's hard because you've got a list of 30 names, and it actually goes to 4 different counselors. So it's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth to try to figure out exactly who has what. It's not tons of time, but it does take careful attention to detail. So nobody got like extra money, particularly for doing this. I mean, I think we might have been able to pay a little extra hours for some instructional assistants or people that could help with gathering some of the information. It's not like you need a full-time person all year or something. Any questions just about that first part, figuring out who gets the seal? Okay. Then you have to do the thing around contacting the candidates. And so in our case, our districts decided to do a school board recognition. So we had to get on their calendar and all that kind of stuff, send letters home to the students so they would know to come, bring their family members, if we had cake, all that kind of stuff. We also sent, as I mentioned, a generic letter to the counselors so that if, they saw some student that they knew qualified and didn't know about the thing, that they could know to give them the information. We had, in some cases, we drove to the graduation site and handed out envelopes like half an hour before graduation to get the medallions to the kids. And then the letters for the test results we prepared afterwards. We left them for the students to pick up, or we sent them to the schools actually to hand out initially just because of the postage budget. But I think this year I'm going to ask the district to provide the money to send them out to the students. And then the whole thing about recognizing the awardees. So that's, sending them to make sure they actually qualify, so you're not sending letters home to kids that will find out that they're not actually graduating this year. And the letters, as I mentioned, the recognition ceremony, however you're going to do it, you actually carry those things out. So it was a madcap couple of weeks, but we pulled it all together, and like I say, 195 kids got recognized. There were questions around the training of people to do these things. And so, last year we didn't really have training because it all happened so fast. I think the things that we did were like communication by email, delivering things in person where needed, phone call follow-ups, lots of emails and calls from students and families that, anytime you do something, students and families always call up, they have questions. And last year, the world language teachers were not really involved. So for this year, some of the things we've done, first of all, it's another long story, but we got the world language teachers are getting some support, me. And so at the first fall in service, probably in about 20 years, we talked about the SEAL and their role, what they could do to support it. So now we're seeing them as advocates for students. And we've always been communicating with the ELL chairs and the teachers and the counselors in the different schools. And now that it's sort of real, the counselors are taking action more in the schools because they're seeing it as real. We do receive monthly announcements about testing and SEAL and things like that, and we will have the families informed by district communications as well. I'm thinking we should try to maybe meet with the high school graduation coordinators in the spring and try to help everybody get really more organized. Here's what I shared with the world language teachers at that workshop I mentioned. Often they say, well, what's in it for me? Why do I want these? If this student goes and gets 4 credits in Vietnamese, he's not going to take French. Well, what we found, having been doing this for a number of years, is that actually kids that are very successful and have their own home language recognized are often very happy now go take another language. Sometimes it makes sense for them not to go into a first-year level, but maybe a second year, because they're really experienced language learners. And so they're not happy with knowing less, they want to know more. And so I don't think it's doing competency-based credits is taking away from our world language enrollments, but I do think it's raising the satisfaction level. And of course, in our state, we are increasing the high school graduation credit requirements, so pretty soon the schools are going to have to figure out how to carve out more time for classes in world languages for more students, because maybe 40% of students take world languages now. If everybody needs it for high school graduation, we're going to need a heck of a lot more teachers, and worse, we're going to need classrooms that we physically just don't have in our district right now. Okay, so that's kind of like the implementation of the SEAL. Again, you could look at this, ask more detailed questions later. And now I do have some information more specifically about assessments. Do you want to ask any more about the SEAL right now before we leave that topic? Yes?
Are the private schools in Washington also participating in this?
They can if they want to. Absolutely, yeah. I don't know if they are or not because the state office doesn't really keep track of that, but they could. Yes?
In Washington State, do you require to take language course that, the SEAL, Japanese, Chinese, in order to get the SEAL of biliteracy? Or you don't have to take, the student don't have to take class, but they can take AP or whatever the test, they can get SEAL.
Okay, so normally students don't get access to take AP or IB tests other than through a class. Technically, they could go take an AP test, but an AP site has to be willing to allow them to do that, and most of them won't do that. So AP and IB is very tightly related to courses in that. Competency-based credits are totally unrelated to courses. And so students can have gone to Japanese school for 5 years and now go take competency-based credits, and if they earn 4, they can get the seal of biliteracy even if they never had a day of Japanese in the school setting. And many schools don't offer Japanese, so you know that might be very important to a student to be able to have that choice of what language is important to them. We don't have a wide range of offerings, I'm sorry to say, especially in Seattle schools. We lost German a few years ago. French is not universal. Spanish is universal. Japanese is kind of in the north, and Chinese is in the south right now. But, and we have after-school programs, like with One World Now for Arabic and Chinese, now Korean, and they have sort of their own little system for things. But it's very normal in our area for students to be learning and working on languages outside of the school day. We're not very committed in our state to languages in the school day. So yeah, that's that. I should say that, you know, I mentioned before I'm responsible for our 10 international schools in Seattle. As it happens, our model for international schools includes language or dual language immersion. Some of the programs are two-way, where they meet the needs of Spanish, English language learners. Half the group is that group, and half is native English speakers approximately. And some are just whoever shows up. But they're definitely not all monolingual English pretty much ever. But we have Japanese immersion and Chinese immersion, as well as the Spanish. So it all depends, and it varies from year to year. Last year, for example, half the kids entering the kindergarten Japanese immersion program in one school were native speakers of Japanese, so that was great. But it wasn't by design, because we don't control the assignment plan. So in our overall testing plan for our immersion programs, we do use the stamp test at various points. And one of the points when we use it is at the end of 8th grade. So one of the things we determined earlier on was that students that have been learning in an immersion setting for 9 years, let's say, from kindergarten, they're all over the map, and you can't just say that because they were there that they should get 2 credits or 3 credits or 1 or 5 or whatever. And so we decided to, as soon as we implemented competency-based credits in general, we decided to implement it specifically for our immersion continuation program in the middle school. So at the end of 8th grade, all of the students that are in what we would call an immersion continuation course, they have different names in different schools, take the same test that we use in general for any other students, the stamp test, in Japanese, Mandarin, or Spanish, and based on that, they are awarded credits that they will get when they arrive in high school. Typically, if they were to meet our targets, target proficiency levels, then they would be qualifying for 3 to 4 credits out of 8th grade. Not all students meet those targets, especially Japanese is a little bit lower, and but generally they're qualifying for at least 2 to 3. And then the placement in high school is another whole topic, but that's the general idea. I'd say probably maybe 70 to 80% of the Spanish students can earn up to 4 credits. Okay, any other questions just about this part?
So for many of the languages spoken in the world, we don't really have adequate proficiency tests. And for those tests, in order for students to have equal access to competency-based credits, what sort of
What do we do?
tools and what sort of tools?
I'm so glad you asked. That's the next topic. Okay, that was exactly the situation that we faced in 2011 when we launched this effort. We knew that a large number of students could be dealt with stamp test, like all the Spanish, Chinese, Arabic, French, etc. But what about like Russian or Korean? And then there was like Amharic and Somali. And so this has been our journey to test things out, the options that were available, in some cases find new ones, and also come up with a solution that gives us flexibility to support what my friend David Bong from Avant Assessment calls the superlictals, the really, really, really less commonly taught tested languages in this country. So here's just a quick overview of this. I mentioned the criteria earlier this morning, so you know that we needed to provide multiple opportunities, the English we already talked about, to demonstrate this. So these are what were outlined in there. So demonstrating proficiency, competency-based credits, and so on, and that the intention is to support any language that would come up in our schools. So I've got a couple slides about understanding proficiency. This was, we talked about that a little bit with Linda. I just want to remind you what it is. It is testing proficiency, particularly in the production of writing and speaking, is not about multiple choice questions or closed tests or fill in the blank or questions about the language or things of that sort. It's a description of what individuals can do with language in terms of speaking, writing, listening, and reading in real-world situations. So it's task-based. It's always based on providing a task to someone to do something with. And the levels of proficiency, we use the ACTFL proficiency guidelines. So we use that scale. That scale can be used for any language, including English. And it's a very similar scale that is used for ASL as well. So if we are basing it on proficiency, then what can we do around assessment? So that's where we get into how we've done the competency-based credits. Let's see. So this was some background of how we got there. I'm not going to go into that. Oh, okay, maybe I will go into this. So we had a model policy and procedure, and I'll show you later because that's the model procedure is where it outlines that in our state, the expectation is that to award competency-based credits based on a national assessment, not based on a French teacher talking to a kid on the side and saying, I think you belong in French 2 and I'll give you 2 credits or whatever. If it's going to be based on this national process for competency-based credits, it has to be an assessment that the state office has authorized, has approved to be used. Those have to be aligned to it has to be something that can be aligned to the ACTFL proficiency guidelines. So you have some way of determining how many credits, or in this case, the threshold of intermediate mid. It's got to have some kind of comparable thing, level like that. It also has to have components where the students are actually producing language that can then be evaluated. So we realized that in terms of the testing process, the state wasn't going to start offering tests, and we certainly had no way of collecting money from districts or students or anybody. But our state World Language Association, WAFLT, that I've mentioned before, was willing to partner. So WAFLT got contracts with the major testing companies, Avant Assessment for STAMP, Language Testing International for ACTFL tests, and then we've got a couple of other options that we're now using as well. And then the districts could request the tests. WAFLT got the codes, gave them to the district, or the codes or tests, whatever it was, sometimes it's a paper test. The district does the testing, sends them back to the testing companies or through WAFLT to the testing companies. And in the registration form, the student had to agree to share that data with the state office. Then I would get the results and I would prepare the materials because I would know exactly from the test results from the testing company what they got, and I would turn those back. That part is no longer being done by the state office. It is being done by the individual districts, except for the small districts where WAFLT continues to support that. So we started that process. I've got a few slides that just overview the assessments we've used. I've mentioned STAMP, the Standards-Based Measurement of Proficiency from Avant Assessment, a number of times. That's the easiest, least expensive test to use. So where we've got a language for that, we generally use that. For languages like Arabic and Chinese, if a student strongly prefers to write by hand, then we'll use ACTFL tests instead, because STAMP is all online. We use the ACTFL tests. We prefer to use the computer-based OPIC, Oral Proficiency Interview, because it's much less expensive and it's much easier to schedule. You just get the code and you deliver it. And the Oral Proficiency Interview is very risky because the cost is about $140. And once you've got the date, if the student doesn't show up, you pay the money whether they show up or not. So it's kind of risky that way. So we've moved toward, if it's a language like Russian, Korean, or Persian, that the preferred assessment is ACTFL assessments. We use the OPIC, the computer-based. And then the writing proficiency test, we have generally used the handwritten one, just because people, especially for Russian and Persian, often prefer to write by hand. You know, they may not have learned to type that well. So those are kind of the two top assessments that we've been using. Originally, for languages that were not covered by ACTFL or by STAMP, we worked with the Center for Applied Second Language Studies, which was also the research behind STAMP originally, to get appropriate writing and speaking tasks that we could administer to the students. Those tasks, just the way that STAMP is set up and ACTFL test the same, the task is described in English. It's not described in the language that you're going to be evaluating. So it would say, like, you know, you need to tell your neighbor that you can't help them with their yard work this weekend because you have other plans or something like that. So you're writing a note to the neighbor to say something like that. It's a task. So the description of the task would be in English, and then they write in whatever the language is. That's why the same tasks can be used for multiple languages. Now, some tasks may be not as culturally appropriate in some cases, but you know, we haven't tailored down to the individual language at this point. We certainly expect to do it when we start testing indigenous Native American languages as an example. But let's say Ukrainian, for example. If there's a task that relates to how to use a cell phone, for example, chances are if those kids are using Ukrainian on a day-to-day basis, they probably can talk about cell phones. In the worst case, they might not know the right word and they put the wrong word. But because this is about overall proficiency, the fact that you had a word or two wrong isn't going to be the most important thing in how it's assessed. So it's actually worked pretty satisfactorily. So for the 2012, really up until this year, 2015, that's what we did, is we had the examples and we sent them out from the state to the sites, and the writing was done by paper, so they would scan it and send us back. The speaking samples we collected in a tool that was developed by Castles called LinguaFolio Online. So we identified 3 prompts, and then the students would record in there, and that's how we got speaking samples. Now, who evaluated them? So, well, let's go back to who evaluates STAMP. So if you think about any assessment like STAMP, they train people who then are evaluating all of the samples that they have to do. In STAMP, reading and listening are measured by multiple choice questions in English. So they're rated immediately. A person doesn't have to rate them. It's the writing and the speaking that a human being does. So STAMP has a very nice sophisticated system where those samples, you know, whoever's a rater hears, okay, I've got a Spanish sample to do, so they go and rate that one, and different people rate different ones, whatever, and all that gets collected, and they do enough double rating to ensure that there's consistency across the raters, and that's how they come up with the score. And because there's 3 prompts, that also helps the case that somebody did, you know, they just did one really poorly, but they had 2 that were stronger. That won't pull the whole thing down necessarily. So STAMP has to identify people from the community that know those languages, and they have to learn to use the tool that STAMP has, the environment for actually doing the evaluation and the rating. Okay, it's basically a similar thing for Language Testing International, for the ACTFL tests. It's a very big process to become an OPI evaluator. It's not quite as bad to evaluate OPIC, the computer-based, because you're just listening and you're not actually doing the interview yourself. But writing, similarly, people have to be trained. So ACTFL has a whole process by which they identify people, hire them, pay them, and so on. So we at the state have no idea exactly who those people are, what they do, how they know what they do. We trust that ACTFL is doing, or LTI is doing their job. We trust that Avant Assessment is doing their job. After looking at hundreds and hundreds of test results, you know, if things look wacky, then you would say something. I mean, you wouldn't wait for hundreds, but if you see things that don't look quite right, then you would do something. So in the case of these, what we used to call the proctored writing and oral language tests, the OSPI calls them custom tests now, I was at the time we were doing all of this, I was the chair of the less commonly taught languages special interest group for ACTFL. So through that, I had access to meet people who were working with many of the languages we're talking about. And one of them, Monique Roske, had a translation agency. So she was constantly working with these kinds of languages with government agencies. So she was finding language professionals who could be hired to translate or interpret, or I guess mostly translate many of these languages. So we said, okay, they are not trained as OPI raters. We can't ask them to say definitively this person's at this level or at this level. But can we give them enough guidance to differentiate the levels that we need to do competency-based credits? So can they see the difference between writing, like I described this morning, that's a few words or lists or phrases, that's novice mid, versus intermediate mid, where you might see sentences and so on, and, but doesn't necessarily have to be very coherent paragraphs. And we believed that was possible, so we gave her guidelines. She identified the raters from the professionals she worked with. Sometimes she really, really had to search out. It took us about 5 months to find someone to evaluate Chukis, for example. Maybe she could have gotten someone faster here. And honestly, if we pay a lot of money for those evaluations because those are people that are, I mean, they may have full-time jobs as professors at a university doing Urdu or something, and now they're adding this. So it's a very high premium for this, but we feel that it's so important to get these languages going that, that we're willing to do that. Based on the results so far, first of all, most of these languages are languages spoken by people who have more recently come. And so they often have native-like proficiency. Chances are a lot of them are at the advanced level. So it's not that difficult when you see a full page and a half of paragraph-like text to say, that's definitely at least intermediate mid. We're not asking them to say, is that advanced low or advanced mid? No, we're just saying, is it at least intermediate mid? So because it's tied to that level, we have some confidence that it's reasonable. We also say in the letter, it is quite likely that your proficiency is higher than what is indicated here, but this is enough to earn these credits. So I'd say that of the students that have done this kind of test for these languages, that the majority have gotten 4 credits. We do see occasions where we've had refugee groups come in, students with interrupted education who truly did not have good writing skills. On occasion, we've had to go back and say, I just can't believe this was really novice mid. There's just too much text here. Can you check back again? Well, it was things, but it wasn't related. It wasn't in the dialect, for example, or there were other things that might have been problems. So we go back, we check to try to get as high quality as we can. It's not a perfect system, but we've never said no to a language. So that's kind of the approach we've taken. Now, Monique is not set up like LTI or Avant to do this for everybody in the country, but she said she is willing to support other states. So if you wanted to do a pilot with some of your languages, like Samoan, for example, which is one we do a lot of now in Washington, you could try it and see what you think. And also, maybe you can recruit some evaluators that would like to work for Monique and do this. I think the critical thing is that nobody in the state office, the district, the school, has anything to do with the rating process. That ensures that that you don't have to question, well, did this one evaluate differently from this and so on, and that what we do in Washington is really no different than what you could do in another state because you would be accessing similar, what we call nationally available assessments. Our goal is to offer assessments that are nationally available. Anybody, anywhere could get access to them somehow. Okay. So that's kind of the scenario we had. We also added in 2014, ACTFL came out with an online assessment. It's pretty similar to STAMP in some ways, but STAMP is aimed at grade 7 through adult. So STAMP tests are used at the university level as well. APPLE is really a school-based performance assessment, so it's grade 5 through 12. It's more oriented to school contexts, so it's be very appropriate if you're teaching a language in your school setting, but we felt that a lot of our, especially immigrant kids, have never used their language in an American school setting, so it's not particularly an advantage. So we've used APPLE some, but I can't say that I feel that the results are better than what we are getting from other assessments. In particular, APPLE is pretty inexpensive. It's about $20, so about the cost of STAMP. And the ACTFL writing proficiency test and OPIC, the computer-based oral proficiency interview, are like about $160, $150, $160. So for Russian, some districts prefer to use APPLE. I feel like the results generally are higher when they use OPIC and WPT for a variety of reasons. APPLE is also all typed, so some students maybe do better with handwritten. So that's why you have to kind of decide a little bit about what's the best match for the student when you have multiple options. A couple of years ago, Highline, the school district I highlighted at the beginning, had researched pretty much everything you could do for testing. They looked at BYU tests and a bunch of different things and found what worked and what didn't. And they came across a company, Alta, which offers, they're from Atlanta, and they offer proficiency assessments. They use the ILR scale, the Interagency Language Roundtable, which is correlated to ACTFL. ACTFL was based on it, actually, but it doesn't have quite the same delineations. But it's the same basic scale. So we do use ALTA now. They have a writing test. It's very similar to the writing proficiency test from ACTFL, except that the prompts are written in the home language. That has been a problem for a few students who thought that they could read and write Somali, for example, and they can't read the prompts well enough to write. So that's a little difference. The oral interviews by telephone have generally been very successful for almost all students. They do cover about 90 languages. So basically, you know, you sort of have, do STAMP if you can, do ACTFL where it makes sense, do everything else was left over for us. And then as soon as we've got a language that's in Alta, we use it instead. So like Somali, we used to do with Monique. Now we do it with Alta. If we can use an official company, it's much better and easier overall to manage. And so we try to you cut down the familiar ones like Somali and Amharic and so on, but you get the new ones like Chin and Falam Chin and Tedim and all these other languages that come up very more occasionally that are in Monique's corner. So she sometimes has a real challenge finding people. But it's as there's more demand, we'll find more response, is what I believe. So those are kind of the ranges. These are the way they discuss the custom tests that we now support from Waffle decided that would be our contribution. So we have a testing team, and we handle that. I'll show you the web page where all the information is. The district sends us an Excel file. I need 2 Samoans and 3 Tigrinyas and 4 Marshallese, and we need them in 2 weeks. And we send them the paper copies to photocopy, and I get the test codes for them and send those as well. Starting this year, OSPI had a contract with Avant Assessment to give us a new interface that's through a product called ClassPack. So we find that easier to use and administer, and it's so that's the major difference that we have. So I've probably set up maybe, I don't know, 80, 90 accounts so far this year for different custom tests, and probably about 60 of them have been completed so far. And as soon as I get the results, the paper scan tests back from the district, I send it off to Monique. She goes and gets it evaluated, sends it back, and I send a letter to them that is sort of similar to the letters that you saw here. And I'll show you the webpage where all that stuff is. So I mean, I've given a lot of thought to this over a lot of years, and I've done a lot of testing because we do it so heavily in our immersion programs, for one. Part of the reason I got confident about using the ACTFL tests, even though they're really slated for adults, is that we use them with our high school Heritage Russian students in our Star Talk program at the University of Washington. And when I saw that 14, 15, 16-year-olds were doing fine with them, I mean, they're getting advanced levels, intermediate, high, I felt they were adequate for the purpose. And so that gave us confidence about trying these things. You just have to try things and then gain confidence by what you do. So at this point, as I said, districts ask, well, what about Luganda? Okay, I mean, we haven't said no to a language. It may take us a while to find somebody. We have to pay a little extra to get a language set up, but we'll find it as best we can. So that's our system. And I can assure you that we're constantly scouting for anything that would be a better solution. And of course, we really urge the major testing companies like Language Testing International and like us, Avant Assessment, to increase the number of languages they offer, and they are always increasing, so that helps a lot. These are just some test results from previous years. You can go back and look at this PowerPoint if you want to, but mainly I wanted to just outline the testing options and how we got to where we got. So let me just, one other thing in relation to that. Why were we so committed to figuring out how to serve all those languages? And somebody you mentioned, we did get through this project with these 7 districts in South King County, a grant of $500,000 over 2 years from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to introduce competency-based credit testing in those districts. A couple of had already done it, some had not done it at all. So some of the money, most of the money went to the districts to help them have the meetings, to get started, do the school board policy, whatever they needed to do, and start testing. Overall, most of the money paid for tests, and a lot of those tests were expensive. Those districts have a large number of Ukrainian and Romanian and Moldovan and Oromo and Tigrinya languages that aren't offered by ALTA and so on. So they needed more money to pay for those. And it was more or less to prove the point that it could be done. A portion of that money also went to Education Northwest, which is a regional lab, education lab, to do 2 studies about the impact of this. And so I've got links to all of this that I've given to our roadmap folks here to share with you so you can go look at those studies. Did it benefit students and how did they feel about it? I'm going to just show you a couple websites. OSPI, as I mentioned, is our state agency, and so on the Seal of Biliteracy page, you can find, and this will be evolving, I'm quite sure, but this is the current information from the state about how the Seal of Biliteracy works. You'll notice that one of the things they talk about is competency-based credit steps, like what you have to do to make that happen. So if you go to that page, they've divided it up into kind of like what, it's got our video, for one thing, if you ever want to look at it again. It's got steps for students. The steps for students are really very similar to the brochure. So like determine if you're eligible, take the test, and so on. So the determine if you're eligible is just a series of can-do statements that are at the novice high level. So if you feel comfortable doing those, probably you're going to earn credits. To take the tests, for this part, they have to identify their language, and then it'll identify which assessments are available. So let's say I think you guys have, let's say Ilocano, for example. So Ilocano is available through ALTA, so it describes what they'll do. And then if they want to learn more about the tests, then they can visit those sites to see. So one of the sites is the one where we have the custom tests. I don't think I'll do that right now. And then the getting credit is like, where do I test? How do I find out? How do I prepare for it? Things like that. And how do I get it onto my transcript? So those are kind of the steps for students. Back on the districts, that's probably what interests you, is like, what do districts have to do? And this is how OSPI has divided it up. It's like there are one-time steps, which is just setting up the policy and procedure. In our procedure, if you want to go look at it at some point, outlines what back in 2010 we felt were the reasonable assessments were available. Decide how, who's going to pay for it. Are you going to pay for the district? Are you going to pay for all students? Where are you going to offer it? All those are decisions that a district has to make according to what makes sense for them. In some districts, it makes the most sense to do it like school by school by school. In Seattle, we found that a lot of our eligible ELL students had gone through our what we call the Seattle World School, which is a secondary bilingual orientation center, and it's very central. They felt very comfortable coming back there on a Saturday with nice, friendly people and taking the assessment there. That was easier rather than trying to go to their comprehensive high school someplace across town and arrange for it. I have to say, we just did testing actually at one of my international schools, which is in another part of town. They did it after school because it seems more convenient. I don't think students do as well when they do it at the end of a school day. I think it's more helpful actually for them to just leave, come to a fresh place on a Saturday and just do it. We've done a lot of testing at the University of Washington, also Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma. I think doing it at the university setting is also a really great thing because it sort of indicates that the university thinks it's important. So sometimes we want to be too efficient, and being more effective is actually a better idea. But each district is kind of figuring out its own way. I have a touch screen, so I keep wanting to do that. Let's see. So that has links to all the different places. And, okay, those are the one step. Sorry, the registration, you have to schedule dates and all that. So it just tells what to do. Then how do you arrange the testing? And then what do you do about results and so on. So one of as I said, the custom tests are the ones that, let's see, do they have the link there? They maybe don't even have the link. Let's just see. Well, I know it's on the student one, so I'll go there. The information about the custom tests are, oops, sorry, wrong one. On this page with waffle testing. So on that page, there's also sample letters. There's the critical information that we need to register students for testing. I mean, pretty much if you looked at this page, you'd have the critical information to develop relations with the major testing companies that can support proficiency testing in any of the languages, including the less commonly tested ones that I mentioned. So, sorry, I did a lot of talking. I know I threw a lot of information, but I just wanted you to kind of be aware of the work here that we've done in Washington is based on pretty much nonstop work since about 2008, and a major grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, so that we were highly motivated to find solutions. Thousands of students tested. So it's, you know, yes, if you can find better solutions, by all means, please share them with the community. But I don't think you have to start from scratch. You know, start with what we did and improve on it. Don't feel like you gotta just go reinvent everything. But I do believe very strongly in the principle of not imagining that out of nothing you can create a cadre of evaluators out of your current language teachers or community members that can consistently and reliably do the evaluations. I'm talking about for decisions about credits. Now, we do want those people to be working with the students to develop the language proficiency and the literacy. Absolutely, we need our community people to do that. And some of them might become very great candidates. Maybe that's a future job for them. I mean, think about it. There's going to be thousands of students potentially in the United States that need to have Ilocano evaluated. So why couldn't they be somebody from Hawaii? They could, but they need to be done under guidance and so on. So let's go back to our little powwow circle and continue conversation, wherever you'd like to take it.
That 500,000, is that for like 10 high schools at so many assessments? Is it just the central office kind of?
No, the $500,000 grant covered an entire project, which included the project management. It was half of it paid for my salary, some assistant. It included the development of the whole system, the communications about it, the working with, we had several districts that were not very open to doing this, so there was a lot of just hand-holding and babysitting and figuring out what they were going to do and how they were going to do it. Each year, the districts got about $15,000 toward testing. Some of them needed more than that, like maybe 20, a few used a little less. So 15.
Yeah, 15 or 20, but what are you talking about?
Hundreds of students.
Hundreds.
Well, yeah, because a large number would be tested for about $20 a piece, you know, for the stamp test, a large number, all the Spanish and Chinese, Arabic, French, German, and so on, Japanese.
Some of those tests were like 140, right?
All of those were stamp tests. Those were about $20. Russian, Korean, Persian, we used ACTFL tests, so they're about 150. The proctored ones we did at the time they were about 160. Then we've raised the prices slightly just because it was getting too expensive for Waffle to try to.
But your 15,000-ish plus would have to cover all three of those assessments.
It covered all assessments needed. Yeah, and so that's what the districts got allocated. However, a big chunk also went to partners like Education Northwest that did these reports and studies, so it's never cheap working with them. Another chunk went to Schools Out Washington that did some initial research, outreach work. Another chunk went to the Ombudsman's office to do the brochures and so on. So, you know, it's distributed about a month. You cannot say 50,000 was X number. It was, I mean, if you think about the numbers of schools that were impacted in those 7 districts, I don't know exactly how many high schools they each have, but I suppose that on average they have 3 or 4, and Seattle's got about 12. So
when you say 10 comprehensive, that's more than one high school.
10 school buildings in Seattle, plus there's some other smaller high schools. It's at least 25 high schools for 3 years, really, effectively. However, other districts did not get any support whatsoever, and they just paid for all their testing. They had 200 students. I mean, it still was probably in the neighborhood of 10 to 15,000 that they were paying. The district paid for it, and generally the schools have not paid for testing. Generally, it's a district. In some cases, like some of the newer districts that are coming on board, they've left it up to the schools to handle it. In some cases, the PTA has raised money and they pay half the price, and sometimes they've used money from the student, like ASB fund if they want to. It's certainly possible for students to pay themselves. So for example, Seattle, we opened our doors to any students anywhere who wanted to come to test, and UW did, but people had to pay for their tests. So
It's like a running start, or if you were paying for your own dual credit.
in a sense, yeah, in a sense. I mean, you're paying, like in Running Start, you'd be paying for your books or something. So the students just sign up, pay the money, and then come. And in the early years, you know, people were bringing cash and checks, and we just about drove going crazy. Now we do it with brown paper tickets, and so the students all have to pay in advance. So one thing I didn't share is that as this system developed, the University of Washington became quite interested because they had a problem group, namely students who had a language that wasn't taught at the university, and somehow they'd gotten into the university through admissions. They said, oh, you're a native speaker of Tigrinya, so you're in. And so they were now in the university, but there's an exit requirement, the equivalent of a 103 course or like a third year of high school. And the languages weren't taught at the university, so they would have had to go and spend a whole nother, 15 credits of tuition to take some new language to meet that exit requirement, but they were speakers of Somali or Tigrinya, for example. So the university decided that students that had languages not taught at the university could do our process. And then we just do a letter to the university that says, this student qualified for 3 competency-based credits, 3 high school, which meets your exit requirement of 4 or something. No, the UW doesn't, the UW requires the students to pay for it. So the students pay, and it's like $160. That's a lot less than 15 credits. And so the challenge with that is, honestly, there are students who probably had good usable skills at one point in their lives, but having not had any education or writing or reading in their home language since, whenever they came, and just completing 4 years of university, they can't write it. They don't have, it's not even academic, they can't write it. I mean, they physically could write some words maybe, but they don't remember anymore. And so we want to catch those students. We feel like they should be caught before they start the university, not after. And of course, we would like to promote the continued teaching of the languages at the university level too. The districts that were participating in this particular project now are very actively involved in a project called Speak Your Language, which is to promote home language development. And they've hired, for example, a Somali specialist to go into the schools that don't have dual language immersion programs for Somali to try to work with the Somali kids and the communities to build opportunities in the after-school world or whenever for the students to continue developing their language skills. So that's sort of happening whenever and wherever it can.
Were you like Illinois, where you had a pilot? It sounded like they piloted one high school. Was it all 25 the first time, or you did like one site?
Well, we're talking about 2 different things. Competency-based credits just unrolled whenever, wherever anybody wanted to do it once.
People just raised their hand and said, I'm in, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
The seal of biliteracy technically was not implemented until there were rules, which was June of 2015. However, a couple of these districts did their own little seal thing in 2014 just because they wanted to. So it wasn't a state seal because there were no rules yet. They didn't have criteria, so they had to make up their own. So it wasn't an official one. So 2015 was the first time that districts could offer the seal officially. However, it was so late in the year, the state did not do any broadcast communications, so the state considers they're not really implementing it until spring of 2016. Do you guys want to just pick up again with where you're at, with what you're thinking about where things would go? We don't have to limit it to the topics that that I was talking about. I know it's a ton of data and a ton of different stuff, but what do you think would be most useful at this point, Lynette?
Well, Dina also said if after all of this, any of you had other ideas to add to, the papers that you've been collecting along the way, suggestions and so forth.
He needs it for
use my teacher voice.
He needs it for the video.
Could you, maybe you can bring it up now, especially after what Michele shared with us as far as the testing and things like that. Anybody else has other additional ideas?
Hi, I'm from the community, and I advocate for community involvement in this whole thing, because they are the ones where what we say, the rubber meets the road, is the community who speaks the language. Okay, so my question is, in Washington, have you worked with any community agencies out there to actually pilot or justify the validity of all these assessment tests that you've developed? I know piloting stage is something that educators really look at in order to see how this can be done. So I guess that's my question.
Yeah, absolutely. In part, just because of the reality of how it unrolled, the competency-based credits, it started with pilots in 2011. So Seattle did some initial testing. Highline tested some different languages just to get an idea of how the different assessments worked for that. And similarly, when we gained confidence pretty quickly with STAMP and in the ACTFL assessments, especially after we'd worked with the Russian students. And then Highline had used ALTA for a number of their students, so we had some confidence about the experience of that before we added it to the list. I do say that I think ALTA can sometimes be a bit more challenging for the students than some of the others, but also sometimes they assess quite a bit higher on ALTA than they do, than as a group we see in some of the other assessments. So it just varies. You know, some students don't like an online test that well, so there's variations like that. As far as, for example, let's take Samoan as a language, or Marshallese or Oromo, those languages that we're doing with the custom tests, because they are the same kinds of prompts, in fact, some of them are prompts that were developed for STAMP, we know that they were already validated for a variety of languages by the testing company or by our partner at the Castles at the University of Oregon. So we didn't sit down and make up some prompts. We took ones. However, if they gave us 12 prompts to choose from, we identified that some were not very appropriate, like tell your host family in the country that you're visiting that da-da-da-da. It doesn't make sense to give an immigrant child a prompt like that. So we eliminated the ones that we felt were totally inappropriate that way. We left in a few that, like I mentioned, the cell phone example, where a person might wonder, but in my experience of hanging out with like Russian students and heritage learners, they can generally talk about those things because they're using cell phones all the time. So even though if you went to a remote village, people might not be talking about that thing in the context of where kids are actually using this language, it's not that difficult for them to manage those. So in other words, we get prompts that have already been validated by the testing company, and then we filter a bit more based on the fact that so many of our test takers will be immigrants.
Yeah. I test for ACTFL. It's Samoan language. I was sent. Samoan? Yes, I was sent to New York.
Samoan is not even listed on the OPI.
It is. I tested for them for 5 years already, even right now as a certified tester administrator. But those tests are only for workforce development, workforce people. And this is for the Department of Defense with the Army and
ILR,
military.
the ILR tests, yeah, that's different. Yeah, the education, ACTFL has tests for like you say, the government, and tests for education. And so we use the ones from education. That's probably why Samoan is not there. Why don't you add it?
Yeah, well, they gave us the tool, and I had to work to translate everything. And some of those questions are really good. And I can say as an educator, I'm a teacher, a classroom teacher myself. And I can see how those questions can really critically help a child think in terms of how you can apply your language with, when you're in the workforce.
Are you talking about the interview protocol?
Interview.
Yeah. So just to get a little more background on that, an oral proficiency interview is a kind of a protocol. It's not really a script. It's an approach to how you communicate with the person you're testing to kind of develop some comfort level in things that are familiar with, and then trying to take them up to what is the level where you get to something that they're not comfortable with. So that's how you determine their level. They have to reach a level where I really can't say anything about nuclear engineering, or something like that. And that's where you decide that they're advanced mid instead of superior, for example, just because of the range of topics. The other thing is that typically we have much greater control of vocabulary and grammar accuracy on topics that we're familiar with. So the minute you get into a topic you're less familiar with, your grammar and stuff becomes more problematic. So that's also a clue that you're maybe more in the intermediate than, say, an advanced level, or advanced low as opposed to advanced mid and so on. But they've got a whole process. It's a very rigorous process to train ACTFL evaluators, absolutely. But that would be a wonderful thing to advocate, is to get some Samoan, and for example, on the education side, so we would have access.
Yes, we really need it, because I'm running a Samoan language school, here in Hawaii, and it's evolving. We just opened up 3 sites here on island, but it's all community-based. Some are retired teachers, others that are, they're teachers from the island, but when they moved here, they cannot even pass praxis to go in to work for the Department of Education. So I was able to tap into some of those teachers, community teachers, and I can see how it's empowering them to actually look at language as a career or something that they can help their children. So the empowerment side of this work is unbelievable. And I can say that within the community, you get them involved, especially with families, and also getting their intellectual ideas and knowledge to share with everybody. They're comfortable sharing it with us because we're in the community, and they see that, this is about my culture, this is about my language. So I'm free to share that. But within the education, they're intimidated.
Of course,
a lot of them, they don't want to share. So within this community implementation with language, teaching language, and they're also learning new English vocabularies. So hopefully...
Yeah, actually along that line, in fact, I was just at the meeting on Thursday working with our Professional Educator Standards Board, which is the agency that's responsible for teacher certification and so on. We are working on a pipeline project for valuing bilingual employees in the schools, like instructional assistants. We have many people that come in, they were actually teachers in their home countries, and they're working as assistants or something because they don't know the path to become a teacher, or it's too onerous, or it's too expensive. And so what we'll be trying to set up is a way to make it more doable for them, to have greater level of support, financial clarity about how to get there. But we want, for example, we want Samoan-speaking teachers in our classrooms, whatever they're teaching. And of course, if they're prepared as teachers, then it's an easier step to offer Samoan more directly to students, too, in the school setting.
And I like how this symposium is providing resources for myself as well, because some parents, they would come up and say, I want you to test me how I speak Samoan, whether it's at the chiefly level or the lower level. I said, we're developing the test right now.
Well,
but,
and of course, an on-demand assessment for something like Seal of Biliteracy or competency-based credits does not replace the need for ongoing formative assessment as part of the learning process. And so that's a place that we can also provide tremendous value to the community-based schools to have more effective approaches to assessment in their school settings. What we found, especially from the Vietnamese community, this was what was kind of coming to us from the Vietnamese teacher leaders, that you have people teaching the language that were never trained as language teachers. So they may be native speakers, but they don't necessarily know what works. And so how to bring in the whole fold. If you ever spend a moment teaching language in your life, how do you see yourself as a language teacher, whether you're certified or not? And how do you be the best language teacher? And that's something we've done. I mentioned the Russian program for students, but we also have a teacher program, and most of our teachers are heritage speakers, or they're native speakers who may have come, they may work at Boeing or something like that, but they teach Russian school all weekend. But they don't know how to be Russian language teachers. So now we are taking workshops out to them in their community schools so they can be aware of the standards for world language, the best practices, everything that Linda described that we think is important in language teaching, how to make that available to them, as well as resources, for example, from the home country. Russia has got a lot of expertise on pedagogy in other countries too.
Along that line, Michele, I have a question. Hawaii is on a shoestring budget, in fact, maybe no budget. So as far as the testing, we would like to give them as much options as possible, especially for the principals themselves to see what options are available for their students. And then as you notice, there's very many least commonly taught languages in Hawaii. What about language exams? Do you accept like the national Spanish exam, or the Japanese has a national Japanese exam?
Yeah, we don't use any of the national exams for competency-based credits because they're not necessarily aligned to the ACTFL proficiency guidelines, so there's no way of determining that it's one credit too. But for the seal of biliteracy, that was part of the conversation, and I expect that once the basic seal rolls out, that some of those assessments will be appropriate. However, some of them don't have production components, like speaking or writing, for example, and then it would not be acceptable. So as long as they have speaking and writing, like the DELE does for Spanish, then it's likely it would be accepted. The other challenge is the equity issue. The DELE in our state is only offered in 1 or 2 locations once a year or something. It's pretty costly, and so it's not something that students can just say, I want to go take the DELE. I mean, they have to get to the University of Washington, they have to pay for the thing. But if they're already paying for it and planning to take it, then it could be an option.
Okay. I think principals in Hawaii have a lot of, they have the autonomy to award credits or do these kinds of things. So that might be one way that the school will empower themselves as far as the seal of biliteracy. If there is an experience or an exam that's acceptable and we have it on the general list, then that's one more thing that they can add to them.
Yeah, I think it's really, really helpful just to centralize the list of acceptable exams for the seal of biliteracy. I think it's a disservice to say, do something, and then if you gave them some credits, give them the seal.
Could you share with us a little bit about what you do for students who are in special education or GATE or your ASL students, American Sign Language?
So ASL is interesting. The North Carolina ASLTA offers a test that can be aligned to the ACTFL proficiency guidelines. So you could award a novice mid, novice high, and so on. So we have done that for competency-based credits. I don't think anybody has gotten the seal of biliteracy yet because it's only been a few students who tested. The big challenges for the ASL test is that you have to have the proper video equipment. And so if you're just an ASL student in a school that, say, doesn't offer ASL or doesn't have an ASL teacher or doesn't have the right equipment, then it's not really easy for the school to figure out how to support it. So right now, we're kind of in a negotiation about whether sites like the University of Washington, which has that equipment, could host that assessment. And then there's just the issue of places, individual testing companies or like this North Carolina, they're not necessarily prepared for 295 districts to contact them individually to request tests. So if it's coordinated through our World Language Association, we feel like it's more doable for the testing company, and that's how we did it the first few years. So I know we can do ASL, but there are the barriers of having the proper video equipment to do the signing and so on. So ASL was one. What was the other?
Special education.
Special education. Okay. So the first thing is to understand what kind of accommodations would that student normally have. Because the stamp test is not timed, that already is a very big accommodation because they can retype, they can re-speak their prompts and so on. So that's already a very big accommodation for a lot of students. Obviously, another accommodation if they can't type, I mean, for some, typing is an accommodation over handwriting. If they don't feel comfortable typing, doing the handwritten one is one. We have had some requests about transcribing and so on. And I believe we've done at least one test where that was the case, where the district official policy was to transcribe for the student. So the student had to produce their original speaking, but then it had to be transcribed. It's a little bit tricky, and we haven't had enough cases, I think, to fully document what could be done. But of course, there's no reason why we would not want to make it possible for anyone who could have that opportunity. And of course, the other thing that's interesting is many people with special needs, communication is not the major problem. For some it is, obviously, and that's where, for example, being on a telephone call with another human being might be very uncomfortable for someone maybe on the autistic spectrum, but being with an avatar might feel perfectly comfortable. So you'd have to decide which test is the right one. And of course, we always allow retests. Some of the tests have a timeline, like you can't just repeat an ACTFL test 2 days later, but a few months later you can come back. In principle, STAMP you could redo sooner if we allowed it. So that's why we feel that it's very user-friendly from that point of view. Normally, if a district paid for the assessment, they won't pay twice, but they'll pay. I will say, however, they do pay for several assessments. So we have a lot of students that do Amharic and Tigrinya and sometimes even Oromo. It's like, do you really need 3? But, what the heck. If they've got them, we'll go for them.
They still have to be proficient on the ESPA, right?
Well, they have to.
Still need the English proficiency as well?
In our state, for the seal of biliteracy, they have to meet graduation requirements for English, not ELL for English. That means they have to pass the SBAC test and.
I was talking for our special education.
Oh, for special ed. Oh, I see. I don't know about
You're making
that.
accommodation for the assessment itself, but they would still need the English proficiency on the standardized test?
Well, I would have to say that if they have met the requirements in order to graduate in relation to English as a special ed student, then I think we would respect that as meeting English proficiency expectations.
That conversation is being held at the DOE. And were you in that conversation? Where Petra and...
I don't think anything was decided yet.
Yeah, they're still in the works.
You can start coming to those meetings, Camille.
I'll leave it to you guys.
Those are wonderful, wonderful questions, and I think they're the kind of question that really can only be addressed by having an actual case. And let's work through it and keep the intention in mind. It's not to create barriers for people; it's to create doors.
Along those lines, could you speak a little bit to the results of the study? And has this, I guess what I'm getting at is, this whole session was on assessment, right? But has this also had the intended outcome of what we heard more about this morning in terms of more language programs being offered, more kids studying languages, there being a different perception about languages, and then maybe opportunities for jobs in the future? Or are we starting to see some of that? Maybe it's too early, I don't know.
Well, some things are probably too early, but the executive summary that I gave you from that report from Ed Northwest, this one was, number one, in this case, it's not about the seal, but about the competency-based credits that are behind the seal in Washington. So the question was, did it make a difference? Did students need those credits? And so in this, the summary was, world language credits help some students graduate on time and become college eligible. So about 21%, this was just focus groups that they did, so they didn't, no, this is actually the data analysis. So they looked at data that came from some of the districts, needed them to graduate on time from college, and about 10% needed them to be eligible for a 4-year college. I mean, they were planning to go to a 4-year and they needed them. Interestingly enough, more Spanish-speaking students needed world language credits to graduate than did speakers of other languages. So a third, 34% of Spanish-speaking participants needed the world language credits to graduate, compared to about 12% of speakers of other languages. One of the reasons for that is that a lot of the ELL students who tested in Somali and Punjabi and so on, Burmese, if they arrived by 9th grade, they get to or if they had any high school upon arriving, then they get to count a lot of their previous credits. So they might need fewer credits than students that were born here or came, in earlier childhood. So that's an interesting thing. Let's see. This was interesting. He says, unexpectedly, the study also found that fewer current English language learners needed the world language credits to graduate and be college eligible than other participants. So in essence, a lot of our exited ELL students or students that had another home language but maybe had never qualified for ELL services, they were actually not very academically successful, and so they needed more credits. Whereas the students that actually came with another language, both because they might have some credits from their home country, and sometimes they were simply academically stronger because they'd had a longer time learning in their language. I believe that's the reason anyway. And so they had a higher level of success in high school and got more content credits. In other words, in our area, some of our biggest challenges are kids that were born in Seattle and or Highline. I mean, they didn't immigrate. They were born there, but they did not have an enriched home environment that developed fully a home language, nor did it develop English. And then you see long-term ELLs and intransigence in terms of really achieving, you know, we just see an academic achievement gap, opportunity gap that you can't get rid of, you know. So that's why we have that campaign, the home language campaign, because we believe if we strengthen what's already available in the home, it will increase the results when they get to school. So anyway, the other thing was that all of the roadmap districts said that even without the grant funding, they would continue the program. So our experience is that once a district tests a few students and sees the results, a few $100s, even a few thousand, even 10, 12, 15,000 that you might spend for testing is so rewarding when they see the hundreds of credits that the students have earned, for example, or when they get the seal, that they have something so tangible that is meaningful to them and recognizes something that is their personal contribution to who they are that has never been recognized. How can you complain about $5,000 or 10 or 15,000, you know, and it takes some effort by people, but it usually fits into your job description. You just do it, you know.
I think, Andy, we're going to have to wait to see where Hawaii goes with the seal, and hopefully we will get the benefits from our story. I think we're just about wrapping it up. So
Thank you so very much. I know it was a really data-intense afternoon.